Some people can't stand being wrong in front of someone they love. Not because they're cruel, and not because they don't care. Something quieter is happening. Something almost invisible, even to them. I've watched people twist a conversation without ever raising their voice, without ever seeming angry at all. Just quietly, calmly, rearranging the facts as they went. A simple disagreement turns into someone else apologizing first. A small mistake somehow becomes the other person's fault by the end of the sentence. Nobody planned it that way. Nobody sat down and decided to do this on purpose, the way someone plans a lie in advance, carefully choosing every word beforehand. And that's the part that never made complete sense to me. If it isn't planned, if it isn't calculated, then where is it actually coming from? There's a man I keep thinking about, someone I've known for years now, in different versions of the same story. Let's call him Daniel. Daniel isn't cruel, and Daniel isn't cold. If you met him at a dinner party, you'd probably like him right away. He's funny, he's attentive, he remembers small details about your life that you mentioned only once, months ago. People describe him as easy to talk to, easy to trust. But there's a version of Daniel that only shows up at home, with the one person who knows him best. His partner will bring up something small, a forgotten errand, a missed message, a tone that felt sharp earlier that day. And within seconds, Daniel isn't really listening anymore. He's already explaining, already defending, already searching for the one small detail that shifts the weight somewhere else, anywhere else, but onto him. You always do this. You're remembering it wrong. I wouldn't have to react this way if you didn't push me first. None of it sounds like an attack, at least not from where he's standing. It sounds almost reasonable in the moment, almost fair. That's exactly what makes it so hard to see from the outside, and even harder to see from the inside. His partner walks away from these conversations confused, sometimes even quietly convinced she was the one who overreacted. She starts replaying the conversation later that night, wondering if maybe she really was too sensitive. And Daniel walks away feeling, for a few minutes, safe again, even if he couldn't explain why. I used to think this was simply about control. Some people just want to win, I thought. Some people just need to always be right. But the more I watched, the less that explanation held together on its own. Because the strange thing is, Daniel doesn't actually feel powerful in those moments. He feels cornered, almost trapped, even though nobody is truly cornering him. His hands get tense before he even notices it happening. His breathing changes before he even opens his mouth to speak. Whatever's happening inside him in that moment doesn't look like dominance at all. It looks much more like fear, quietly wearing the mask of confidence. And that's the question that wouldn't leave me afterward. If this isn't really about winning the argument, if it never was, not even once, then what is he actually trying to protect underneath all of it? What could possibly feel so dangerous that his whole body prepares for battle over a missed errand? Maybe you felt something like this yourself, in a much smaller, quieter way.
A partner points out something you did, something small, something that shouldn't matter much. And before you can even think about it, your body already knows exactly what to do. It shifts the blame slightly, softens your part of the story, sharpens theirs instead. Not out of malice, not out of any real intention to hurt them, almost out of pure instinct, the way your hand pulls back from something hot. Afterward, there is a strange aftertaste, a small discomfort you can't quite name or explain, like you protected yourself from something, but you're not entirely sure what it was. That feeling is worth sitting with for just a second longer than usual, instead of rushing past it toward the next distraction available. Because underneath it, something much older is usually quietly at work. Here's what kept surprising me the deeper I looked into all of this. The people who do this the most are rarely the ones who feel too much confidence inside. They're usually the ones who feel the least of it, somewhere far underneath the surface. The stronger someone insists they're right, the more likely there's an old wound flinching beneath that certainty. It's almost a strange kind of hidden math running quietly in the background. the louder the defense sounds, the more fragile the thing being defended usually turns out to be. Which means what looks like ego on the surface is often something much closer to self-preservation. Not the healthy kind of self-preservation, but the kind that got built early, in childhood, long before anyone had the words for what was actually happening at the time. Think about a child who got laughed at once for making a simple mistake. Not abused, not neglected in any obvious way, just laughed at, once, in a way that somehow stuck. Or think about a child whose parent always needed to be the one who was right about everything. That child learned early that being wrong meant being small, being unimportant, being slightly unloved for a moment. That child grows up eventually into an adult who looks confident on the outside, but the body remembers, even when the mind has long since forgotten the specific afternoon it happened. So the nervous system quietly builds a rule for itself without ever asking permission first. Being wrong equals danger, the rule says, plainly and simply. And it never bothers updating that rule, even decades later, even in a relationship where the danger isn't real anymore. This is where the pattern stops being simply a bad habit someone could just choose to drop, because the brain isn't trying to make anyone else unhappy on purpose. The brain is doing exactly what brains are built to do, which is protect the person carrying it. It uses whatever information it learned early, whether or not that information still applies. If shifting blame once made a scary feeling disappear, even for a moment, the brain files that away as useful. It doesn't check whether the method was fair to anyone else involved. It only checks whether it worked, quickly, quietly, without asking for consent. And so, the pattern repeats itself, not because someone consciously chooses it, but because some quiet part of them still believes it's keeping them safe. Knowing this doesn't make the behavior disappear overnight, not even close, but it does explain why it never seems to happen in isolation, in just one relationship, in just one mood. Watch closely enough, and you'll start to notice it isn't only arguments at home. There's a meeting where a colleague makes an offhand comment about a missed deadline, and before the sentence is even finished, an explanation is already forming, already pointing somewhere else entirely. There's a phone call with a parent where an old disappointment gets mentioned gently, almost in passing, and somehow, within a minute, the whole conversation becomes about how misunderstood the listener has always felt.
There's a text message that arrives at exactly the wrong moment, a slightly cold reply, a joke that lands strangely. And the response isn't curiosity about what happened, it's a quiet redirection instead, a subtle way of making sure the discomfort lands somewhere else. I've seen this happen at family dinners, where one sentence about the past turns into 3 people defending 3 different memories. Nobody in the room actually seems to be lying on purpose, they just each seem certain that being at fault, even slightly, even briefly, is somehow unbearable to sit with. There's a version of this at work, too. Quieter, harder to name out loud. Someone gives feedback on a project, gently, carefully, trying not to offend anyone. And the person receiving it immediately starts listing every reason the timeline was unfair to begin with. The actual feedback never really lands, because it never gets the chance to. There's a version of this in friendships, where one friend gently says, "That hurt my feelings." And instead of an apology, the friend hears a list of reasons why they were actually too sensitive. The friendship survives, technically, but something quietly gets smaller between them each time it happens. There's a version of this with parents and adult children, maybe the quietest version of all. A grown son mentions carefully that a comment from years ago still stings a little, even now. Instead of hearing it, the parent hears an accusation, and the conversation quickly becomes about how hard parenting always was. The original feeling never actually gets acknowledged, not once, not even briefly. It just gets buried under a much longer story about effort, sacrifice, and everything the parent went through instead. There's a version of this in new relationships too, in the earliest weeks, before anyone even calls it a pattern yet. Someone mentions gently that a joke felt a little unkind,
and the other person doesn't pause, doesn't ask what they meant, doesn't get curious about the impact. They immediately explain their intentions instead, as if intentions were the only thing that ever mattered in a moment like that. It's such a small exchange that almost nobody would flag it as anything serious, but it's often the very first thread of the same fabric, appearing long before the relationship has any real history yet. You may recognize a version of yourself in at least one of these moments already. Maybe not loudly, maybe not often, but somewhere in some relationship, this pattern has quietly shown up too. It doesn't mean anything is fundamentally broken in you as a person. It usually just means, at some point, being wrong felt like far more than simply being wrong. Here's where the pieces really start fitting together in a way that becomes hard to ignore. Because it isn't the deadline conversation or the family dinner or the argument at home that matters on its own. It's what all of them have quietly in common underneath the surface. Every single time, someone felt a flicker of exposure, a flicker of, I might be seen as flawed here, and the response was always the same, almost word for word. Redirect, defend, protect the fragile thing before anyone gets close enough to actually touch it. This is usually the moment people stop calling it a coincidence anymore, because once you see the pattern once, you start seeing it everywhere. In yourself, in people you love, in people you used to admire without question. And here's the harder part to really sit with once you notice it. This isn't a flaw in someone's character, in the way we usually think about character. It's a loop instead, reinforced every single time it appears to work. Each time blame shifts away successfully, the brain quietly notes, that was useful, do that again next time. Over time, the loop gets faster, more automatic, harder to even notice happening in real time. Relationships slowly shrink around it without anyone deciding that should happen. Not dramatically, not all at once, but a little at a time, the way a room gets smaller when you keep adding furniture nobody asked for. The partner learns to bring things up more carefully, choosing words like they're diffusing something. Or eventually, the partner stops bringing certain things up at all. The friend learns to soften every piece of feedback until it barely resembles feedback anymore. The child learns, quietly, without anyone teaching it directly, that certain topics simply aren't safe to raise. And slowly, without anyone naming it out loud, entire subjects quietly disappear from the relationship altogether. Money becomes something nobody mentions directly anymore, because it always seems to end the same way. A certain memory from years ago becomes something everyone silently agrees not to bring up again. Even affection starts to change shape a little, offered more carefully, measured out in smaller amounts than before.
Not because love disappeared, but because honesty started to feel like it cost too much each time. None of this happens because someone set out to control anyone else on purpose. It happens because an old survival strategy never got updated for a life that no longer requires it. But here's the part that actually gives me a strange, quiet kind of hope. If this pattern was learned, somewhere, sometime, it can also be noticed, eventually, by the person carrying it. And once it's noticed, even once, it starts to lose a little of its automatic grip. Because the goal was never to accuse the fragile part hiding inside someone. The goal is closer to understanding it, the way you'd understand a smoke alarm going off every time someone makes toast. The alarm isn't broken exactly, it's just outdated, still reacting to a threat that isn't actually there anymore and hasn't been there for a very long time. So what actually changes once someone starts to see this pattern in themselves? It isn't a sudden transformation, not overnight, not in one conversation. It's smaller than that, and somehow far more honest than any big transformation could be. It's a pause, half a second longer than usual, right before the old defense kicks in automatically. It's noticing the tightness in the chest before the sentence comes out, and choosing, just once, differently. Choosing to say, you might be right, instead of finding the nearest exit from the conversation. It's realizing, slowly, that being wrong about one small thing has never actually meant being unworthy of love. That belief was installed a long time ago by someone in some moment that had nothing to do with the person standing in front of you now. The people who slowly unlearn this pattern don't become perfect, not even close. They still flinch sometimes, especially when they're tired, or scared, or caught off guard. But the flinch gets shorter each time, a little more manageable, and the apology, when it finally comes, starts to feel less like defeat and more like relief. Not because apologizing suddenly feels easy, but because the old danger, the one the body kept preparing for, quietly stops showing up as often. It also changes how someone listens, not just how they respond in the moment. Instead of hearing an attack in every piece of feedback, they start hearing something closer to information. A partner's frustration stops sounding like a verdict on their entire character and starts sounding like a request instead. That shift alone, small as it sounds, changes the entire texture of a relationship over time. Arguments get shorter, not because people stop disagreeing, but because disagreement stops feeling like a threat to survive. Silence after a mistake starts to feel less like punishment and more like simply a pause to breathe in. None of this arrives all at once, in one dramatic breakthrough evening. It arrives in fragments, in small victories that mostly go unnoticed by anyone except the person living them. Think back to Daniel for a moment, the man from earlier in this story. Not the version explaining himself at the kitchen table, defending every small detail, but the version underneath it, the one with the tense hands and the changed breathing. That version was never actually trying to win the argument. He was trying not to disappear in some small, old, half-forgotten way that had nothing to do with tonight. Once you see that clearly, it's hard to watch him the exact same way again. The defensiveness stops looking like arrogance and starts looking instead like a much younger version of him, still trying to protect something nobody ever taught him was already safe. And maybe that's true for the people you've struggled with too in your own life. Maybe it's even true for you in the moments you've least wanted to admit it out loud. Not an excuse for the behavior, just an explanation, quiet enough to finally make sense of something that never used to, something that felt for years impossible to put into words. And maybe that's the strange gift hiding inside a story like this one. Not a diagnosis, not a label to carry around, but a small flashlight pointed at something that used to live entirely in the dark. Once you can see it, even faintly, it stops running the whole show without your knowledge. The next time someone you love gets defensive over something small, it might be worth pausing, not to excuse it and not to let it slide without any honest conversation at all, but to wonder, quietly, what that defensiveness might actually be protecting underneath before reacting to it directly. And the next time you feel that same tightness rising in your own chest, it might be worth pausing too, not to judge yourself for it, but to simply notice it, the way you'd notice weather changing. That noticing, small as it sounds, is usually where everything slowly starts to shift, quietly, patiently, one honest moment at a time. If you recognized a part of yourself or someone you love in today's story, I'd love to know which moment stayed with you the longest. Someone else, reading it later, might finally understand a pattern they've been living inside for years without ever having a name for it. And if you're curious where this same quiet mechanism shows up next, in friendships, in parenting, in the smallest arguments that somehow never stay small, in the quiet moments you least expect it, I'll see you in the next conversation.